violently, "Don't tell me!" One must always bear in mind that Beckett wrote Waiting for Godot as a divertissement from the awful confrontation of his prose. The comedy is often farcical, in the manner of early Chaplin. Elements, especially in the tramp-like appearance of Vladimir and Estragon, are purposely Chaplinesque, their actions likewise, with dropping trousers and other ludicrous incidents. At the same time, the relationship between these two main characters bears many similarities to that of Laurel and Hardy. They are both fond of each other and exasperated with each other. Despite their differences, they are, in their different ways, utterly dependent upon each other. They could not survive alone. Their exchanges both goad and encourage. They enable them to pass the time, to avoid facing up to their situation. Their endless conversation contains much affectionate, well-honed repartee. According to Beckett's friends, his wrangling conversations with Suzanne often took on this same conscious music-hall quality of ritual and repartee. This appears to have first developed during their long trek south through war-torn France as a means of overcoming the tedium and suffering of their journey. Vladimir, sententious. "To every man his little cross," he sighs. "Till he dies," afterthought, and is forgotten. Estragon. "In the meantime, let us try and converse calmly, since we are incapable of keeping silent." Vladimir. "You're right, we're inexhaustible." Estragon. "It's so we won't think." Vladimir. "We have that excuse." Estragon. "It's so we won't hear." Vladimir. "We have our reasons." The scenery, or lack of it, a country road, a tree, would seem to depict some featureless rural spot somewhere in France, though it could almost as easily be some barren spot in the Wicklow Mountains, where Beckett had spent so much time on lonely walks, listening to the voices of his own mind, arguing with himself. Vladimir is the tall, thin, intellectual figure who has seen better times. Estragon is short and fat, with occasional female undertones to his character. Vladimir. "Do you remember the Gospels?" Estragon. "I remember the maps of the Holy Land. Coloured they were, very pretty. The Dead Sea was pale blue. The very look of it made me thirsty. 'That's where we'll go,' I used to say. 'That's where we'll go for our honeymoon. We'll swim, we'll be happy.'" Vladimir. "You should have been a poet." Estragon. "I was." Gesture towards his rags. "Isn't that obvious?" Silence. Vladimir. "Where was I? How's your foot?" Estragon. "Swelling visibly." Along with the misery there is, of course, the tedium. As Estragon puts it, "Nothing happens, nobody comes, nobody goes, it's awful." At one point on their blasted heath, however, Vladimir and Estragon encounter another strange couple, Pozzo and Lucky. The self-important Pozzo carries a whip and leads his servant Lucky by a rope around his neck. Lucky is weighed down, carrying his master's various possessions, including a picnic basket and a stool. Pozzo and Lucky appear as a parody of the master-servant relationship, but there are also elements of psychological metaphor here, with Pozzo as the ego or even commanding superego, and Lucky as the unconscious mind. Before they take their leave, Pozzo makes Lucky give a performance in which he thinks aloud, whereupon Lucky simply opens his mouth and delivers a torrent of words, an uninterrupted jumble of nonsense and cliché, continuing in a flow of association. Lucky. "Fulham Clapham, in a word, the dead loss per caput since the death of Bishop Barclay being to the tune of 1 inch 4 ounce per caput, approximately, by and large, more or less to the nearest decimal, good measure, round figures, stark naked in stockinged feet in Connemara." Pozzo and Lucky proceed on their way, but are encountered again in the second act. This time Pozzo is blind, and Lucky is dumb. Lucky is still carrying Pozzo's possessions, but he is now leading Pozzo, who follows him by hanging onto the rope around Lucky's neck. Despite this, Pozzo is still very much in charge. Again, their relationship is open to political or psychological interpretation, but is best appreciated as the farcical personal situation it purports to be. Here is Laurel and Hardy taken one step further. Instead of a loose, knockabout personal relationship, as with Vladimir and Estragon, we now have an inflexible power relationship. As Pozzo prepares to leave, Estragon asks him, "Where do you go from here?" Pozzo replies simply, On. Such purposeless endurance is a theme that runs throughout the play. The first act ends. Silence. Estragon. Well, shall we go? Vladimir. Yes, let's go. They do not move. The second act finally ends in identical fashion. The bemused, chastened, or entertained audience eventually breaks the ensuing silence with sporadic and then mounting applause, frequently interspersed with cheers, boos, and catcalls. Waiting for Godot had a mixed reception from the beginning, and there is something about its challenging informality and apparent formlessness that seems to release an audience from its inhibitions. Few leave the theatre without their own very definite opinions having been provoked. No one wishes to feel that he or she has been made a fool of, either in the theatre or in real life. And life, or drama, in Beckettian form, can easily be seen as a load of rubbish, or, alternatively, as refreshingly free from comforting preconceptions. Stoic indifference among audiences of Beckett's plays is rare. When Beckett finally completed both Waiting for Godot and his trilogy, he lapsed into apathetic exhaustion. The psychological toll involved in the intense introspection of the trilogy had been immense. In the midst of this, his mother fell seriously ill, and it became clear that she had not long to live. Beckett returned to Dublin, where all the guilt and angst he had experienced with regard to his mother surfaced once more as he attended her deathbed, watching her die. After the funeral, he returned to Paris, where his constant state of despair was punctuated by nights of drinking. His failure as a human being and as an artist now seemed all but complete. A photograph from this period shows a skeletally thin figure with a bemused, all but defeated expression. Yet he had done what he had felt impelled to do. The artist in him had fulfilled himself in his own wilful way. In his perversity he had undeniably achieved uniqueness. But the self-lacerating human being in him was aware that what he had produced was all but incomprehensible to anyone else. No one would ever want to read such unreadable prose, let alone put on such undramatic drama. Although Beckett appeared no longer to believe in himself, one person at least still retained faith in his baffling work. This was Suzanne. She reproached Beckett for not sending out his manuscripts. He merely shrugged, telling her to do whatever you want with them. So she decided she would do just that. If Beckett wouldn't attempt to have his work published or performed, she would. Tenaciously she lugged his manuscripts from one small Parisian publisher to another, leaving the manuscript of Waiting for Godot at the door of a succession of small avant-garde theatres. It was only through her persistence, in the face of any number of puzzled or dismissive rejections, that Beckett's work ever saw the light of day. In 1951, Suzanne's efforts finally came to fruition, of a kind. A French editor with a soft spot for Ireland and all things Celtic imagined he had come across a typical example of classic Irish humour, a rarity which was all but unknown in French translation. As a result, Malloy, and then Malone Dies, were eventually published in French in a limited edition by Éditions de Minuit, Midnight Editions, the former clandestine resistance publishers. The appearance of these two difficult novels attracted a few favourable mentions in avant-garde literary magazines, but little widespread recognition or commercial success, causing the publishers to abandon the idea of bringing out the unnameable. Instead they issued the script of Waiting for Godot, which appeared in 1952. Some months later the owner of the tiny Théâtre de Babylone on the left bank agreed to stage the play. Although neither Beckett nor Suzanne realized it, he had already given up on the theatre. "I am going to close up shop, and I may as well close up on a beauty," he told Beckett's friend Roger Blynn, the avant-garde director who had agreed to see the play through production. So rehearsals began. Despite Beckett's shyness, he soon began taking an increasingly interfering and dominant role in these sessions. As one of the actors remarked, "Beckett does not want his actors to act. He wants them to do what he tells them. When they try to act, he becomes very angry." Beckett knew precisely what he wanted. "There is nothing more grotesque than tragedy," he explained cryptically. His plays were not intended to be naturalistic, more ritualistic. The parts required an interpretation that was stylized rather than psychological. Yet, despite his increasing involvement, he refused to give any hint to the actors of the meaning of what was taking place on the stage. Beckett would always insist upon taking such a leading role in the production of his